Ethan hadn't been back to Mill Creek in over a decade. The small town in rural Oregon held too many bad memories. His mother's death, his father's drinking, and the eerie pine forest that surrounded their old house. But now, at 25, his father's passing forced him to return. He drove past the empty gas stations, the abandoned diner, and the one blinking streetlight that still worked. Mill Creek looked just as forgotten as he remembered. The house was worse, dust-covered windows, vines creeping up the porch. It felt like time had stopped, but something else felt off, the forest. It was too quiet, no wind, no birds, just an unnatural stillness. It reminded him of something from his childhood, but he pushed the thought away. He was here to clean up and leave. That night, Ethan found his old journal in his childhood room. As he flipped through the pages, one entry caught his eye. March 17, 2005, the tall man came again. Stood by the trees, watched me from the dark. Dad says I'm dreaming, but I'm not. A chill ran through him. He had forgotten. When he was 10, he used to see something standing in the woods behind the house. A figure, too tall, too thin, its arms stretching too long. It never moved, never made a sound. Just watched. His father had called it nightmares. But Ethan remembered the terror of waking up at night and seeing it standing at the tree line. He shook off the memory and went to bed. Then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the window. Ethan froze. The knocking came again, a little harder. He turned his head expecting to see nothing, but there it was, a shadow, standing at the edge of the forest, too tall, too thin. The same figure from his childhood. A jolt of fear shot through him. He squeezed his eyes shut. It's a trick. It's my imagination. When he looked again, it was closer, right at the edge of the yard. The knocking on the window didn't stop. Ethan locked the doors and shut the blinds. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. The town always had bad reception, but now it felt intentional, like something didn't want him calling for help. Then, a sound came from outside, a whisper. Ethan, come outside. His stomach dropped. The voice was wrong, a stretched-out imitation of something human. Then he heard it inside the house, a creaking floorboard. His breath caught in his throat. The front door was still locked. How did it get in? The whisper came again. Closer. Ethan, I missed you. He grabbed his father's old hunting knife and moved slowly down the hall. The lights flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. And then he saw it. The figure was inside the house, standing at the far end of the hallway. But it wasn't just standing anymore. It was crawling toward him. Ethan ran. He didn't think, didn't stop. He bolted out the door, sprinting to his truck. His hands fumbled with the keys as the thing emerged from the house, unfolding itself to its full, unnatural height. It didn't run. It glided. Ethan barely got the truck started before peeling down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But he didn't have to. The thing was beside him, keeping pace with the truck. Its head twisted toward him, mouth stretching into something that wasn't a smile. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees. Ethan didn't stop driving until he was miles away. Ethan never went back to Mill Creek. The house was sold, the town left behind. But some nights in the silence before sleep, he still hears it. A soft knock at his window, a voice whispering his name, and he knows, no matter how far he runs, it's still watching, waiting for him to come home.
Nathan never planned on coming back to Blackwood. The small, forgotten town in Montana held nothing but bad memories: his mother's death, his father's silence, and the eerie forest that surrounded their home. But after 10 years away, a single phone call changed everything. His father had disappeared. The sheriff said his dad's truck was still in the driveway, the front door wide open. No signs of struggle, but his boots were missing, as if he had walked into the woods willingly. Nathan didn't believe it. His father was a hunter, a man who respected the forest. He wouldn't just wander off. Something wasn't right. So, against his better judgment, Nathan returned home. The town was as lifeless as he remembered, boarded-up stores, rusting street signs, and a diner with only 3 customers who stopped talking the moment he walked in. "You're back," the waitress muttered, not meeting his eyes. "I'm just here for my dad," Nathan said. "Do you know anything?" No one spoke. Then, the old man in the corner, the one with a face like weathered leather, leaned forward. "If he's in the woods, he ain't coming back." A chill crawled up Nathan's spine. "What do you mean?" The old man's gaze darkened. "Folks who go missing here, they ain't lost. They're taken." Nathan scoffed, but deep down he felt something stir a memory from childhood. A nightmare he had buried for years. A shadow in the trees, a sound like bones snapping, and his father's voice, whispering, "Never go into the woods at night." But Nathan wasn't a kid anymore. He needed to find his dad. That night, armed with a flashlight and his father's old rifle, Nathan stepped into the forest. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. No wind, no insects, just an unnatural stillness. Then a sound. Not footsteps, not an animal. A slow, deliberate clicking like teeth tapping together. Nathan froze. His flashlight flickered. Then, just ahead, he saw it. A figure, hunched and grotesquely thin, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. It stood on 2 legs, but they bent the wrong way like a deer that had learned to walk upright. And its eyes black, sunken voids locked onto Nathan's. The clicking grew louder. Nathan took a step back. The creature mimicked him, tilting its head at an impossible angle. Then it spoke. Not in its own voice, but in his father's. "Nathan, help me." Nathan's blood turned to ice. It was impossible. His father was alive? The creature lurched forward, faster than anything human. Nathan ran, crashing through the underbrush, heart hammering in his chest. Branches whipped his face, the flashlight swinging wildly. The sound of clicking teeth chased him, growing closer. Then he tripped. Nathan hit the ground hard, rifle flying from his grip. He scrambled to his feet, but the creature was there, crouching just inches away. It smiled, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. And then, in a voice too broken, too stretched, it whispered, "You look just like him." Nathan fired. The gunshot split the silence. The thing let out a shriek, a sound not meant for human ears, and bolted back into the trees. Nathan didn't stop running until he was back in the truck, doors locked, hands shaking. The sheriff found him the next morning, rifle still clutched in his hands. Nathan told them everything. They didn't question him. They didn't even look surprised. His father was never found. But Nathan knew the truth. He hadn't gone missing. He had been taken. And now, the forest was calling for him too. Nathan left Blackwood that same day, but sometimes, in the dead of night, he still hears it. The clicking, the whispers, and his father's voice calling from the trees. "Nathan, help me."
Nathaniel Carter never wanted to return to Ravenscroft, a small village tucked away in the dense Blackwood forest of Eastern Europe. The last time he set foot in his hometown, he had barely escaped the horrors of the cursed woodland. The things he had seen, things that should not exist, had haunted his nightmares for years. He had spent every moment since trying to convince himself that it had all been in his head. But then the email arrived. No sender, no subject, just a single image attached. A photograph of his childhood home. And standing at the edge of the frame, barely visible among the trees, was his brother, Daniel, the same brother who had vanished in Blackwood Forest 5 years ago. Ravenscroft had always been an eerie place, a village where people disappeared, where the locals spoke in hushed whispers, where the shadows between the trees stretched just a little too long. When Nathaniel arrived, the air itself felt wrong, as if the village had been waiting for him. The few people who remained looked at him with wary eyes, avoiding conversation. He tried asking about the forest, about Daniel, but their expressions would turn cold. "Some things are best left buried, Nathaniel," said Mr. Holloway, the aging owner of the gas station on Main Street. "You got out once. Don't be a fool and go back." But Nathaniel had to go back. He needed to see if Daniel was truly alive, or if something else was wearing his face. He entered Blackwood Forest just before sunset. The deeper he went, the more the silence pressed in. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his own breathing. It was as if the forest itself was listening. Then the trees began to change. Their bark looked scorched, blackened with symbols carved deep. He ran his fingers over one of them, feeling the grooves beneath his skin. It pulsed like a heartbeat. A whisper slithered through the trees. "Nathaniel." He froze. The voice was soft, familiar. "Nathaniel, help me." It was Daniel's voice, but he knew better. The whispers followed him as he pressed forward, growing more insistent. Then he saw them, figures tall, thin, watching from the tree line. Their limbs were too long, their eyes hollow pits of glowing amber. They didn't move. They simply stared. A wave of nausea crashed over Nathaniel. He gripped the knife at his belt, his only weapon, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't dealing with something human. Then the figures began to shift, moving in unnatural jerks, first closer, then farther away, as if reality itself was warping around them. The whispers turned to laughter. A voice, Daniel's voice, spoke from the darkness. "You should never have come back." Nathaniel stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The figures melted into the trees, their glowing eyes disappearing into the abyss of the forest. Then the world around him shifted. One moment he was on the trail, the next he was standing in a clearing, a place he recognized. Daniel's old campsite. The tent was still there, but shredded, the fabric torn apart as if by claws. The campfire pit was filled with bones, human and animal alike. And then, just beyond the fire, Daniel, or what was pretending to be Daniel. His face was pale, stretched too thin over his skull, his mouth a gaping wound of teeth, his eyes black, endless voids locked onto Nathaniel. "Brother, stay!" Nathaniel turned and ran. Behind him, laughter erupted from the trees. Nathaniel ran blindly, branches slashing at his skin. The path twisted and shifted beneath him, the forest rearranging itself, trapping him deeper within its grasp. The whispers became screams. Faces flickered in the darkness, dozens, hundreds, all with Daniel's eyes, all grinning that same too-wide smile. He stumbled into a clearing and froze. Before him was the cave, the same cave where he had first seen what Blackwood was hiding. Inside, something breathed, something that had been waiting for him to return. Daniel's voice came again, but this time it was closer. "Nathaniel, don't you remember? You never left." A hand clamped onto his shoulder. He turned and looked into his own face. The thing smiled, and the forest swallowed him whole. Days later, a traveler passing through Ravenscroft claimed to have seen a man standing at the edge of Blackwood Forest. His face was wrong, his limbs too long, his eyes hollow and glowing like dying embers. And when the traveler met his gaze, the man smiled too wide and whispered, "Come back." The village of Ravenscroft remained eerily quiet after Nathaniel's disappearance. Locals whispered about another lost soul, swallowed by the forest curse. Mr. Holloway, the gas station owner, left town overnight. His shop stood abandoned, a layer of dust settling over the forgotten shelves. A week later, a young couple hiking near Blackwood's edge reported hearing Nathaniel's voice, soft, pleading, calling for help. They never found him, but the next morning footprints led from the forest to the town square, and that night something knocked on their window. The villagers started locking their doors before sunset. The knocking did not stop. Some claimed to see shadows moving just beyond the streetlights, growing closer each night. One by one, people vanished. By the end of the month, Ravenscroft was abandoned, its last residents leaving in terror. But the forest remained, and it was still hungry.